November 1939. Europe was on fire. Germany had invaded Poland. Britain and France were already at war. But in the far north, in snow-covered, silent Finland, everything was still wrapped in an icy calm. A silence so deep it could freeze one's breath. Yet within that silence, the whisper of an approaching storm could already be felt. The Soviet Union had made up its mind. Finland was too small, too weak, and too close. Its land was necessary for the safety of Leningrad. In Moscow, everyone was confident. This war would last only a few weeks. A few tanks, a bit of artillery, a few assaults, and the Finns will surrender. So, a Soviet army of 450,000 men advanced toward the Finnish border. Facing them were only 160,000 Finns. But there was one crucial difference. The Soviets didn't know this land at all. In Finland, winter wasn't just a season, it was a test. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Frozen roads, endless forests, blinding snow, and, hidden within them, countless eyes. Finnish soldiers. They waited silently. Their rifles were old, but their minds were sharp, full of traps and plans. Finland's commander-in-chief, Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, sat quietly over his map. His strategy was simple yet bold. We are not fighting to win this war. We are fighting to survive. But to survive, we must confuse them. That sentence reshaped the spirit of every Finnish soldier. This was not merely a military struggle. It was a mental war. By late November, Soviet tanks crossed the border. Barbed wire, trenches, and then nothing. The Finns were gone, as if the earth had swallowed them. Soviet commanders were puzzled. Where did they disappear to? The answer was terrifyingly simple. They were everywhere. Finnish soldiers wore white camouflage suits. They were invisible in the snow, as if they were part of winter itself. They appeared from nowhere, fired, and vanished again. As Soviet tanks rolled forward, strange sounds echoed from the forests. Sometimes a shot, sometimes just the whisper of wind. But for Soviet soldiers, those whispers carried fear. The Finnish army was small but clever. They knew the Soviets were fighting with machines, so the Finns decided to fight with nature. They blocked roads, froze swamps, and turned forests into traps. As Soviet convoys advanced, roads disappeared beneath the snow. Tanks got stuck, fuel froze, communication lines were cut. It was as if the land itself was fighting back. Each night, Finnish soldiers split into small groups. They moved on skis, gliding silently through the dark. They attacked camps without warning. No sirens, no shouts, just one moment of silence, then a scream lost in the frozen night. This was the new style of war, the Winter War. Here, cold itself was the ruler. In Moscow, things still seemed easy. Newspapers declared, Finland is on its knees. But in reality, Finland was rising. The Finns were retreating, yes, but with every step, they lured the Soviets deeper into the trap. Their goal wasn't to stand still, it was to confuse. By mid-December, something strange began to happen. Soviet units lost contact with each other. Columns wandered through the snow with no sense of direction. Frostbite, hunger, confusion. Worst of all, they didn't understand what was happening. They were part of a vast army, yet each man felt utterly alone. This was Finland's first great victory, deception. No one yet knew that this tiny country would leave its mark on world history. But one thing was already clear. This was more than a war. It was a battle of mind versus might. And in this frozen struggle, no one yet knew who would truly become the master of winter.
The air on the Finnish front grew even colder. It was mid-December. The snow deepened, and with each step, the Soviet tanks sank further into the frozen earth. But for the Finns, this snow was not an obstacle. It was a weapon. For them, every tree was a shield, every layer of ice a trap. The Soviet army believed it had advanced hundreds of kilometers, yet in truth it was circling in the same place. At the center of the front, in the Karelian Isthmus, one name was constantly whispered: the Mannerheim line. Soviet propaganda claimed, "We'll break through this defense line in a few hours." But that line was far stronger than concrete. It was a psychological line. Finnish Commander-in-Chief Mannerheim had built it years earlier, sensing a future war. He knew Finland could never match the Soviet Union in numbers or firepower, but he could do one thing: confuse them. The Mannerheim line was designed so that each trench and bunker seemed isolated. Yet together, they formed a labyrinth of deception. Sometimes Soviet tanks thought they were fighting in a village, only to realize an hour later it was a trap made to look like one. The Soviets pounded the defenses with artillery, shaking the frozen ground. Snow burst upward with each explosion, but when the bombardment stopped, silence. No one appeared. It was as if the Finns had vanished again. In reality, they had already moved, slipping through the trees to new positions. Finnish soldiers had one rule: never fire twice from the same spot. If the enemy found you, you lost your silence. And for them, silence was as deadly as gunfire. During this time, a new concept emerged within the Finnish army: motti. It meant dividing the enemy into small, isolated groups within the forest and destroying them one by one. But motti was more than a tactic, it was a mindset. The Finns knew they couldn't win great battles, but they could win 100 small ones. They split the massive Soviet columns into fragments. One group would lure the enemy, another would burn their fuel trucks at night, and by morning, the roads would be cut off. The Soviets no longer knew where the attacks were coming from. At night, sounds echoed from every direction, as if the forest itself was speaking. A Soviet officer wrote in his diary, "This is not a war. It is like fighting a ghost in the dark. We do not see them, but they see us." The air on the Finnish front grew even colder. It was mid-December. The snow deepened, and with each step, the Soviet tanks sank further into the frozen earth. But for the Finns, this snow was not an obstacle. It was a weapon. For them, every tree was a shield, every layer of ice a trap. The Soviet army believed it had advanced hundreds of kilometers, yet in truth it was circling in the same place. At the center of the front, in the Karelian Isthmus, one name was constantly whispered: the Mannerheim line. Soviet propaganda claimed, "We'll break through this defense line in a few hours." But that line was far stronger than concrete. It was a psychological line. Finnish Commander-in-Chief Mannerheim had built it years earlier, sensing a future war. He knew Finland could never match the Soviet Union in numbers or firepower. But he could do one thing: confuse them. The Mannerheim line was designed so that each trench and bunker seemed isolated, yet together they formed a labyrinth of deception. Sometimes Soviet tanks thought they were fighting in a village, only to realize an hour later it was a trap made to look like one. The Soviets pounded the defenses with artillery, shaking the frozen ground. Snow burst upward with each explosion. But when the bombardment stopped, silence. No one appeared. It was as if the Finns had vanished again. In reality, they had already moved, slipping through the trees to new positions. Finnish soldiers had one rule: never fire twice from the same spot. If the enemy found you, you lost your silence. And for them, silence was as deadly as gunfire. During this time, a new concept emerged within the Finnish army: motti. It meant dividing the enemy into small, isolated groups within the forest and destroying them one by one. But motti was more than a tactic, it was a mindset. The Finns knew they couldn't win great battles, but they could win 100 small ones. They split the massive Soviet columns into fragments. One group would lure the enemy, another would burn their fuel trucks at night, and by morning, the roads would be cut off. The Soviets no longer knew where the attacks were coming from. At night, sounds echoed from every direction, as if the forest itself was speaking. A Soviet officer wrote in his diary, "This is not a war. It is like fighting a ghost in the dark. We do not see them, but they see us." The Soviet tanks were advancing. Thick snow and frozen lakes seemed like obstacles, but not barriers. Yet for Finland, this land hid a secret in every snowflake. Every step, every drift of snow, every shadow behind a tree, all could be a deadly trap. The Soviets realized this only when it was too late. The Finnish army had become true invisible warriors. Clad in white camouflage, they moved silently through the forests, shadowing Soviet columns and striking wherever weakness appeared. Their favorite method was the motti tactic. In Finnish, motti means a pile of wood. But here, it wasn't firewood being stacked, it was Soviet divisions. The Finns split the Red Army into small, isolated groups deep in the forests, cutting them off, surrounding them, and destroying them one by one. If a Soviet tank moved forward, a Finnish soldier would silently emerge from the snow beside it, clutching a bottle in his hand. It was a Molotov cocktail. Yes, that name. The Finns chose it as dark humor, mocking Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov, who had claimed on radio broadcasts that we're not bombing Finland, we're dropping bread. So the Finns answered, "Here's Molotov's cocktail, a flaming drink to go with his bread." Soviet soldiers atop their tanks found themselves in a frozen, silent hell. At night, they shivered in -40-degree temperatures. By day, they fought invisible enemies in white forests. Many froze to death. Some discovered that even the oil in their rifles had turned solid. The Finnish advantage was not just courage, it was mastery of the land. Frozen swamps, icy lakes, dense forests all became perfect tools for ambush, attack, and disappearance. A Soviet general would later write, "It felt like fighting in the dark. Everything was quiet. Then suddenly snow erupted, and our men vanished. Under the snow lay minefields, between trees, hidden trenches, sometimes even fake roads. Finnish engineers waged psychological war as much as physical. A Soviet column would enter what seemed like a safe route, only for the ice beneath to crack, plunging men and vehicles into the freezing depths of a lake. Among all the Finnish soldiers, one name became legend, Simo Häyhä, the White Death. Armed only with his sniper rifle, he single-handedly eliminated hundreds of Soviet troops. His name spread among the Red Army like a curse. Artillery barrages and counter-snipers were sent to hunt him down. None succeeded. To the Finns, he was not merely a man, he was winter itself, silent, unseen, and merciless. The Soviets had never expected such stubbornness, such cunning. They believed Finland would surrender in a matter of weeks. But months had passed, and each new offensive turned into another nightmare. Tanks burned, supply lines broke, communication collapsed. For every Soviet soldier, the frozen earth itself felt like the chill of death. At this stage, Finland was achieving the impossible, doing more with less. They fought with brains, not numbers. Winter was their ally. The homeland was their weapon. But Moscow's patience was wearing thin. Rage boiled within the Red Army's command. Stalin had begun to realize that the invasion had been a grave mistake. And soon, the war would enter a far deadlier phase, with thunderous artillery, skies full of bombers, and casualties multiplying in a brutal turning point. Finland's victories beneath the snow had struck at the very pride of the Soviet Empire. Yet this was only the beginning. Winter still ruled, but in the Kremlin, a new plan was already taking shape. In the first months of the Winter War, Finland had shown an almost unimaginable resilience against the Soviet Union, but that was only the beginning. For Moscow, these humiliating defeats, especially under the watchful eyes of the world, were intolerable. Stalin had come to realize that he was not facing an ordinary small nation, but a people whose spirit refused to freeze, who fought among the trees, and loved their land as deeply as their own breath. From this moment, everything changed. Stalin gave a clear and merciless order to the Red Army. Take this land, or let your army be destroyed. These words were more than a command. They were a warning carved into the heart of every Soviet officer and soldier, a blend of fear and absolute discipline. The Kremlin began reorganizing its army. The divisions sent to Finland at the start had been poorly trained and ill-equipped. Now, generals were replaced, supply lines rebuilt, and the troops were given proper winter gear, heavier artillery, and increased air support. Sometimes, dozens of cannons, hundreds of tanks, and thousands of men were sent just to capture a single Finnish village. The Soviet strategy had shifted to one of overwhelming force. Against the Finns' agility and stealth, they tried to use nature itself as an ally. Snow-covered roads were widened, tanks fitted with special tracks, and new paths were cut through the forests. Even temporary bridges were built across frozen lakes. But for Finland, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Their weapons were limited, their ammunition dwindling. Every bullet had to count. Many soldiers hadn't seen a warm meal in days, yet their spirit remained unbroken. They knew that if they lost their land, they lost everything. Stalin's new strategy was brutally simple. Take every inch with artillery, then sweep it with infantry. The cost was immense, but it began to work. The Red Army now moved with coordination. Each offensive was backed by synchronized artillery and air support. By January 1940, after the long, bitter December, the Soviets launched massive assaults. The Mannerheim line, Finland's strongest line of defense, was now under relentless fire. It had taken years to build, but now it trembled under the weight of hundreds of cannons, tanks, and bombers. Every shell felt like it tore a piece from the earth itself. Forests burned, the white snow turned to black smoke. Finland was beginning to tire. Soldiers now fought not only against the enemy, but also against hunger, exhaustion, and the freezing cold. Yet still, they did not surrender. They retreated, yes, but every retreat was planned. Every burned village hid a new trap. Behind each fallen defense line, another was waiting. In Moscow, the taste of victory was already in the air. Stalin was no longer fighting just to crush Finland. He wanted to show the entire world the unbreakable strength of the Red Army. Because elsewhere in Europe, another war was already blazing. Germany's blitzkrieg had stunned the continent, and Stalin knew that the Winter War was only the beginning of something much larger. For both sides, this phase became a test of human endurance. For the Finns, it was a war for existence. For the Soviets, it was a battle for pride and ideology. But in this war, not only guns and tanks spoke, so did nature, willpower, and the cold itself. And together, those three forces could sometimes be stronger than any army. The snow was still falling, but this time it was no longer white. It fell like ash. Each flake landed as a memory on the frozen forests, the burning villages, and the unbreakable spirit of a nation that refused to die. It was the heart of winter. The frozen ground had already learned the sound of tank treads and the echo of artillery shells. But now, everything felt different. This was no longer a war of armies, but a struggle of endurance, willpower, and the raw instinct to survive. The pride of Finland, the Mannerheim line, stood as the last barrier against the Red Army. Built over decades, it was more than just concrete bunkers. It was a symbol of a nation's spirit. Every stone, every trench, every hidden firing position had been carved by Finnish hands, soldiers, farmers, engineers. They all knew that if this line fell, the road to Helsinki would stand open. The Soviets were no longer simply attacking, they were taking revenge. Tens of thousands of artillery shells rained down for days without pause. The sky turned black with smoke, the ground red with fire, and the white snow of Finland had long vanished beneath the storm. Each explosion seemed to make the earth itself tremble. General Timoshenko had brought a new strategy. The goal was no longer a rapid breakthrough, but a slow, crushing advance, bunker by bunker, meter by meter. The Red Army dug trenches through the forests, inching closer to Finnish defenses. Every assault cost dozens, sometimes hundreds of lives, yet still they came, wave after wave. For the Finns, this had become hell on earth. Under endless shell fire, they stood as if balancing on ice. In frozen trenches, soldiers changed their rifles with numb hands, breathing on their fingers just to pull the trigger. Sometimes a Finnish platoon started the morning with 40 men and ended the night with 5. Yet even after every loss, there was no thought of retreat. They knew that behind each bunker lay a family, a village, a memory. For every Finnish soldier, this land was not just a homeland, it was their childhood, their father's voice, their mother's prayer. Soviet tanks kept advancing. The Finns had run out of Molotov cocktails. Some dug into the frozen snow to find traces of fuel. Others tore strips from their own uniforms to make new wicks. They slid under the tanks, set them ablaze, and vanished into the smoke. Here, man and metal had merged. Each explosion, each scream seemed to freeze midair. Parts of the Mannerheim line had already fallen. Soviet artillery pounded day and night, and by mid-February, several sections of the front had been breached. The Red Army had finally begun to break through Finnish defenses. But this victory came at a terrible cost. For every meter of ground gained, hundreds of Soviet soldiers had died. They captured bunkers, only to find a lone Finnish sniper inside, holding off an entire unit. Sometimes silence would fall, and then, from afar, the sound of a Finnish marching song echoed faintly through the snow, as if even in death their will refused to fade. In Helsinki, fear began to grow. Mannerheim himself understood now that the Soviets would not stop. He told the government, "We fight now not to win, but to endure." It was a confession of both bravery and exhaustion. The Soviets had finally learned to use winter as their own weapon. Each day brought more artillery, each night more bombing, and each morning another wave of attacks. And yet, in this frozen hell, one thing never changed: the Finnish spirit. They knew that sometimes victory is not measured by the land you hold, but by the respect you earn from your enemy. And in the end, the Red Army, though not defeated, had grown weary enough to bow before that spirit. They had taken Finland's soil, but they could never conquer Finland's soul. By February 1940, Finland was walking a razor's edge between life and death. The Mannerheim line was shattered, some parts lost, others barely holding, yet the Finnish soldiers still fought.
They no longer fought for victory, but simply to survive, to defend what little remained of their homeland. Each day, each night was filled with the thunder of shells echoing beneath the snow. Above Helsinki, the sky hung dark with smoke. Bombing raids had become routine near the capital. Civilians slept in shelters, yet still listened to the radio, because that voice reminded them of one fragile truth: Finland still lives. Marshal Mannerheim understood the weight of the moment. He had tried every possible way to halt the Soviet advance, but ammunition was running out, food supplies were almost gone, and each soldier fought as if it were his last day. Mannerheim knew that sometimes dying with pride was not as wise as surviving with dignity. In early March, Helsinki reached out to Moscow through secret diplomatic channels. Stalin, too, was ready for peace, because this war had come at a heavy price for him as well. Tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers had frozen to death. The Red Army had lost hundreds of tanks and fired millions of shells. Yes, victory had come, but it was one of the most expensive victories in history. On March 12, 1940, the Moscow Peace Treaty was signed. Finland lost 11% of its territory. Karelia, Viipuri, and the shores of Lake Ladoga were ceded to the Soviet Union. But the most important thing remained untouched: Finland's independence. That day, as the peace documents were signed, snow fell quietly over Moscow. No one smiled, not the Soviet diplomats nor the Finnish representatives. It was not a victory nor a defeat, just an agreement to survive. When the Finnish delegation returned to Helsinki, the people greeted them in silence. No cheers, no flags, but everyone knew one thing: they had not sold their land, their freedom, or their honor. Finland still stood. Mannerheim addressed his people. "We have lost our land, but not our spirit. The winter has ended, but the will of our people will endure forever." Those words became a symbol across Europe, because in that moment the world understood. Sometimes a small nation fighting in the cold can write history against the mightiest of empires. The Winter War taught Europe many lessons. Relations between Germany and the Soviet Union began to shift. Hitler had watched the war closely, and he saw that the Red Army was not as strong as it seemed. That observation planted the secret seeds of Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union 1 year later. Finland began to heal its wounds. The people of Karelia left their homes and moved to new lands, carrying only memories. But among them spread a quiet phrase: "We will return." The war had ended, but winter had not. It was as if nature itself shared in the silent sorrow of this nation. Beneath the snow lay thousands of fallen heroes, each one a symbol of what this frozen war truly meant. The story of people who fought not for conquest, but for freedom, homeland, and honor. Finland may not have defeated the Soviet Union militarily, but it proved something greater to the world. The will of a small nation can be stronger than the armor of empires.